The creator of the universe, the divine one, made an appearance smack in the middle of human affairs, and not everyone was happy about it. God showed up on the scene, and not everyone wanted to join the welcome committee. If there's one thing that today's gospel story teaches us, it's that the arrival of divine love is never met with a uniform response. On this 10th day of Christmas, the gospel story gives us a glimpse of the Feast of the Epiphany, the feast where we celebrate Christ's epiphany to the whole world, Christ's revelation or manifestation to the Gentiles, to the nations. In other words, to everybody, everywhere, including the likes of you and me. Matthew's story makes it clear that not everyone reacts in the same way to that revelation. Listen to how Matthew tells it. When Herod heard this, when Herod heard that Jesus had arrived in the world, he was frightened. Herod hears of the arrival of the divine, and he is afraid. When Herod hears, his fear is so great, in fact, that it becomes murderous. To squelch the arrival of this Jesus, he has all those holy innocents of Bethlehem slaughtered. It's a terrifying story, and one that we know well. Power that holds on through fear is always threatened by the arrival of love. Herod is the archetypical tyrant, the one who kills innocent victims and who tragically is afraid of the very one who would do him no harm. We know the story very well, and Herod is the bad guy, we know. And we know the other part of the story well, too. Know the way that certain others react very differently to the revelation of the Christ child. Certain others who come from the east and faithfully follow the star to the place where it stops. These others are not like Herod, these wise ones or magi, these outsiders from other races, from a different religion, from a far-off, very different foreign country, finally arrive in Bethlehem. And we know what Matthew tells us about their response. When they saw the place that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. It's a far cry from Herod's response. Not fear, but joy is how they react to God's appearing. If you're like me, here's the part of the story where you can enter in. Here's the part where you can identify with Matthew's characters and picture yourself in action. I imagine myself with the Magi kneeling down in homage, bending to honor the one who is God's presence in the world, and offering my gifts. I see myself asking in the words of the hymn, what can I give him? I can give him myself. I want my response to God's revelation to be that of the Magi. Want my response to Epiphany to be welcome and joy and gladness. After all, I'm not like that mean old awful Herod. When God shows up, I'm right there in front, chairing that welcome committee, right? My response to God's arrival isn't varied or multi-layered. Or is it? Or is it? It's so easy hearing this familiar story to make Herod out to be the bad guy, to make Herod the one we're not like. But it's easy to gloss over another detail in the story. It's not just Herod who's afraid. Listen again. When Herod heard the news, says Matthew, he was frightened. So yeah, we know that. Herod gets scared and it drives him to violence. But Matthew doesn't stop with Herod's fear. Herod was frightened, he says, and all Jerusalem with him. The whole city, everybody. Not just the governing king, who would most obviously be threatened by a new king, but everybody. The shopkeeper on the corner, the woman next door with 3 kids, the widower who lost his wife last month, all of Jerusalem, and maybe all of Durango, all of La Plata County, maybe even all of St. Mark's. Because the story of the Magi reminds us that when Jesus shows up, certain kinds of hanging on to power, certain kinds of security, certain ways of understanding the world will no longer do. When God shows up, some things have got to go. When you kneel down, like the wise men did, to worship the one who is the light of the world, you stand up a changed person. You go home, in fact, by a different way. It's not always easy, this letting God into your life. It can be hard to deal with God being revealed in the midst of certain places in your life. When God shows up in the midst of your family life, or into the ways you treat your employees, or when God decides to shed light on the way you handle your money, or the way you cast your votes, or the way you think about all those people who haven't been wearing masks. All that can be pretty frightening at first glance. We give Herod grief for the ways he was afraid, but I think sometimes we're afraid too. We want to be like the Magi, but Matthew probably knew that sometimes we're more like those ordinary folk who, with Herod, were also afraid. Maybe Matthew tells us this to remind us that we're not the only ones who struggle with being afraid. And here's another thing Matthew's story reminds us. Matthew, who wrote very intentionally to a Jewish audience, makes it clear that it's outsiders, those from another place, those from another religion, those who spoke another language, who understood the world in a different way. Those are the very ones who were able to find God, to see where God actually appeared. And not only saw this baby, who was absurdly called a king, but saw him fully, understood him. Matthew tells it in their gifts: gold for a king, frankincense for one to be worshipped, and myrrh for one who would die. They see this Jesus, this one they found so far from home, after such a long journey. They see him fully. Which should remind you and me that those who see God most clearly are not necessarily the ones we've been taught to expect to see God most clearly. That sometimes we have to travel far from home, far from our places of comfort, from the places we know best, if we want to see God. Sometimes, in other words, we have to find God in completely new and different places, and that takes courage, is risky, means leaving home. Sometimes we have to trust that the light of a star, and therefore in the darkness, is what will get us there. We've just finished a hard and dark year, but the story of the Magi reminds us that it's often in the darkness where we can find God, where a new light can shine. Reminds us that we simply need to keep our eyes peeled and follow the eyes of our hearts, as the Magi did, as St. Paul prayed for the Ephesians and for us to do. This morning, ask God to remind you that God's revelation to you is an occasion for joy with the Magi, and not with Herod, an occasion for fear. That letting God be made known more fully in your life will bring light and life, and will drive away darkness and death. That there is nothing to fear and much to welcome. That it's outsiders and unexpected ones who will often teach you the most. Be aware, be courageous, be open, and see just what epiphany will be made known to you. Amen.